The question now is that clauses 1 and 2 stand part.
Mr. Chair.
I call Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The title of this bill is the Health and Safety Reform Bill, and that is what we thought we were going to get: genuine reform of our health and safety regime in New Zealand. And certainly that's why members on this side of the House voted for this legislation at the first reading, because that's what we thought we were going to get, and that is what New Zealand so desperately needs, is genuine health and safety reform. If you compare New Zealand's rate of deaths and injuries at work per capita with any other comparable country, our record is woeful. It didn't take Pike River, or we didn't need Pike River, to realise that we needed genuine reform of our health and safety system. But it took Pike River to create the political impetus for that government to be prepared to do anything about health and safety reform. But even in the absence of Pike River, we knew that we needed reform of our health and safety systems, because we kill and maim more people at work than any other comparable developed nation. So when the government told us we were going to get a Health and Safety Reform Act, we thought that was brilliant. And we thought, when we saw this at first reading, that it was based on the recommendations of the Royal Commission into the Pike River tragedy. We thought that it was based on the recommendations of the government's own independent task force on health and safety, and it was based on the Australian model law. And we thought that looked quite good. And we thought that we were going to get genuine reform of health and safety. How times have changed in the nearly year and a half since that first reading speech. How much things have changed, because that government over there has shown its true colours and demonstrated that reform of the health and safety systems, reform that genuinely will improve health and safety so that workers have a real say about how health and safety regimes will operate in their workplaces, reform that is based on evidence, reform that looks at the things that we know work, the things that have the greatest impact on health and safety in workplaces. That kind of reform has been thrown out the window because of politics, because the National Party has bent over as far as it can to accommodate its supporters in the rural community, to accommodate people like the Tallies group, who came to the Select Committee and told us about how health and safety representatives were going to be the destruction of their business, as though people working in their business were for some reason going to want to destroy it from the inside. So did the government listen to the reasonable, sensible employers who came to Select Committee and said, we think this legislation looks pretty good, it could do with a few tweaks here and there? No. They listened to those who were opposed to the idea of genuine reform, as this title suggests, genuine reform of the health and safety regime in New Zealand. They listened to those who came along and said, this legislation is an overreaction. This legislation is a knee-jerk reaction to what happened at Pike River. That's what some of these employers and other groups came along and told us at the Select Committee. They were in the minority. That's not what the majority of submitters came and told us, but they were the ones that the government listened to. So really, this title has become a misnomer. This title has become completely misleading, because we no longer have genuine reform of the health and safety regime in New Zealand. We no longer have the type of reform that we actually need. And if Andrew Bailey disagrees with me, then Andrew Bailey should get to his feet and take a call on clauses 1 and 2 of this bill and tell me why I'm wrong. And if Andrew Bailey is not prepared to do that, and if Jonathan Young is not prepared to do that, or any of the other national MPs who were on the Select Committee and were prepared to water down this legislation, and were prepared to weaken it, and were prepared to do things that were asked of them, of their special interests, then we have to believe on this side of the House that actually they don't have an argument against us saying that this is not genuine reform anymore, that they actually know in their hearts that we are right and they are wrong. If they're not prepared to get up and tell us, Mr. Chairman, why we are wrong about this, then we have to believe that we are right and they are wrong. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to talk a little bit about the commencement clause Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Lees-Galloway.
I'd like to talk about the commencement clause as well, because this is a rather complicated commencement clause. The different sections of this legislation will commence at different times. It begins, we've got everything from the day after the bill receives royal assent all the way through to the final cut-off point of the 1st of January 2018. So that's around over a period of 2.5 years that this legislation will slowly be rolled out, and that is understandable. Actually, this is a large document. It's 247 pages long, and Andrew Bailey reads every single one of them every night. It could have been comprehensive, Andrew Bailey. It could have been comprehensive, but unfortunately the National Party ripped the guts out of it. So it's not comprehensive anymore. It's just a lot of paperwork for not a lot of substantive change. But this commencement clause does have a number of different parts. Some sections, I've looked closely at which sections will commence immediately after it receives royal assent. And it's some of the more technical aspects, some of those aspects that relate to the Has-No Act as well. My colleague Sue Moroney says some of the more contentious parts. I'm sure that will be part of her contribution on the commencement stage. Most of the bill actually will come into force on a date appointed by the Governor-General by order in council. Now, that is something which often makes members of Parliament a little bit nervous. It certainly makes the Regulations Review Committee a little bit nervous, and there are members of the Regs Review Committee in the House, and I would like to hear from them as well about how commencement clauses that are brought into effect by order in council make them nervous, because what that does is it actually takes the legislative process out of the Parliament's hands and puts it into the government's hands. I don't think that we would be able to support that approach on this side of the House were it not for subclause 3, which says that any provision that has not earlier been brought into force comes into force on the 1st of January 2018. So the government cannot delay the commencement of any parts of this legislation past the 1st of January 2018. And that is it's kind of the quid pro quo, so that Parliament knows this legislation will be fully enacted by the 1st of January 2018, and we will accept that it is practical for aspects of the legislation, a considerable chunk of the legislation, in fact, to be brought into force by order in council by the government. But because we know that that all has to be done over a 2.5-year period, then we will be able to accept that, sir. But the fact is, it doesn't matter how long it takes to enact this legislation, that this is not the reform we were looking for. This is not what New Zealanders were promised. This is not what the families of the victims of the Pike River tragedy were promised. What they were promised, what we were promised, what the people of New Zealand were promised was real reform. Reform based on evidence, reform based on best practice, reform based on overseas changes that have already been made on overseas legislation, which has been working well for a number of years in a similar context to the New Zealand environment. That's what we were promised. That's what we thought we were going to get. But sadly, because this government has been prepared to play politics on health and safety. This government has been prepared to play politics with working people's lives. This bill should no longer be called the Health and Safety Reform Bill. This should be called a list of promises that were made to the victims of one of the most horrendous workplace tragedies in New Zealand and were broken by this national government.
I call Andrew Little.